The heat arrived like punishment, settling over Phoenix in a thick and airless sheet, and for Eric Maddox it felt deliberate, as if the sun itself had chosen him to break first. He moved through the morning on muscle memory alone, sleep-deprived, shaking with a quiet dread he could not name. Sweat gathered at his collar before he reached the car, the asphalt swirled in liquid waves, and the sky promised nothing but pain. Sophie, 3 years old and half asleep, blinked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. He buckled her carefully into the booster seat, whispering that they were late again, voice cracking at the edges like old paint. Narration washed through the scene like slow thunder. Eric's job was a single paycheck away from collapse, custody battles carved stress into his bones, and his love for Sophie pulsed like a bruise he protected with everything he had. The driver's seat burned beneath him, steering wheel scorching hot. He told himself today would go right. He told himself he could keep holding all the broken parts together. Traffic thickened on the freeway, engines growling, exhaust weaving through the open window. Sophie began to hum, soft and bright against the suffocating heat. Eric forced a smile at her reflection in the rearview mirror, though his eyelids felt like weights. Bills waited at home like accusations. The custody hearing approached like judgment. He told himself today would be normal, uneventful, harmless, yet a tremor lived in his hands whenever he tightened his grip on the wheel. A red light stopped them. Time stretched thin. Dialogue slipped through the tension like a blade. "Daddy, it's hot," Sophie murmured. "I know, bug," he said, rolling the window down another inch. "Almost there, I promise." Her shoes tapped gently against the seat. "Will Mommy be mad if we're late?" "For a minute," he breathed, "but grown-ups cool off. Eventually." The radio crackled with warnings, heat advisories, risk of dehydration, temperatures high enough to kill. The words settled over Eric like prophecy. He turned the volume down, but too late. He felt the story of the day forming, slow and merciless. He reached the daycare, bright murals smiling like false hope. Inside, the air conditioning hit cold and sharp, almost cruel after the furnace outside. Eric signed Sophie in with hurried strokes, kissed her damp forehead, and watched her run to a basket of toys. She looked back once, as if she sensed something fraying. He waved, pretending he didn't feel anything tearing loose inside him. He stepped back into the heat, the door closing behind him like a verdict. The sunlight blinded, cicadas shrieked like alarms, and sweat rolled down his spine as though the world demanded penance. He drove away in a daze, telling himself the day was ordinary, telling himself the worst thing life could do had already been done. But unease followed him like a shadow in the passenger seat. Phoenix shimmered beneath a sky too bright to forgive. Somewhere, a future reporter rehearsed lines. Somewhere, courthouse paperwork waited for signatures. Somewhere, a tragedy stretched its wings patiently, unseen. Eric believed he would return in a few hours, believed there was still time, believed mornings were unbreakable. He was wrong. The heat wave did not break. It merely shifted shape, leaving Phoenix sweltering not only with temperature, but with suspicion. When Sophie Maddox died in the daycare parking lot, news anchors spoke her name as if it were a headline designed for shock value. Photos of Eric, exhausted, hollow-eyed, sunburned from that final morning drop-off, flashed on every local screen. Neighbors whispered outside grocery stores. Strangers online became executioners with keyboards. Yet in the swirl of grief and accusation, one decision from Eric stunned the city more than the tragedy itself. He filed a wrongful death lawsuit. The paperwork was stamped within 7 days of Sophie's passing. No funeral had taken place, no eulogy written, no ashes scattered. Instead, his name appeared across legal documents like a bold challenge to the narrative already taking shape. It was as though he had redirected his grief, channeling it into litigation rather than mourning. Reporters swarmed his driveway like vultures sensing opportunity. They waited for him to speak, to break, to confess, but Eric stood behind his lawyer and declared one thing only. The daycare failed her. They left her vulnerable. I will not let her death be meaningless. The quote became fuel for a media bonfire. Narration carried the weight of it. Some viewers saw desperation, perhaps even guilt, masquerading as grief. Others saw a father clawing for justice in the only way left to him. Still, shock rippled through the public. Lawsuits typically came after closure, after answers, after time had sutured the worst of the wounds. Eric's filing arrived like a lightning strike before the rain. Description sharpened like the blade of a camera lens. Outside the courthouse, heat waves rose from pavement like ghosts. Protesters held signs, some demanding accountability from the daycare, others calling Eric a murderer. The wind carried two conflicting truths at once, impossible to separate cleanly. Phoenix felt divided, bruised, and confused. Dialogue appeared only at critical intersections. "Eric," his attorney Maria Ellis warned, her voice low, resolute, "the world thinks you're running from guilt. You're pushing into legal combat before you've even buried her. They won't understand." "They don't have to," he answered. His voice was cracked porcelain, fragile but dangerously sharp. "I need someone to blame. Someone besides me." Maria studied him, searching for something behind those sleepless eyes. Grief, yes. Rage, maybe. But beneath everything, a tremor of fear she could not yet name. Across the country, television studios debated his motives. Cameras flickered, analysts traded theories like currency. And on Law and Crime, one voice cut through the noise with precision rather than spectacle: Dwayne Cates. He leaned forward beneath studio lighting, speaking calmly while the world braced for judgment. "A lawsuit filed this early is unusual," he observed. "It doesn't indicate guilt, nor innocence. It signals urgency, and a man who feels cornered. Sometimes lawsuits are shields. Sometimes they are confession." He neither condemned nor defended, he dissected. The segment aired in the dim living room of Eric's home. He stood inches from the screen, jaw tight, fingers trembling. Dwayne didn't know him, yet spoke as though he could see inside the cracks forming beneath Eric's skin. Anxiety coiled through Eric's ribs like barbed wire. If the world already doubted him, if even calm voices suggested hidden motive, how long before they called him killer outright? Outside, the Arizona twilight sank into molten red, bruised purple, then black. Sirens echoed somewhere distant. Eric closed the blinds, but he could not shut out the world. The lawsuit had been his plea for justice, or redemption, but instead, it invited dissection. Attention. Heat. The kind that never cooled. And as cameras prepared for tomorrow's coverage, the first real fracture in the public narrative was forming, a crack that would lead directly into the investigation no one saw coming, the one that questioned everything Eric claimed to stand for. The next morning, Phoenix woke beneath an unforgiving sky, and Eric Maddox woke beneath something heavier: public scrutiny. The lawsuit had changed the air around him. Where grief once brought flowers and soft condolences, strategy brought suspicion. Headlines questioned intent. Commentators dissected his motives like surgeons probing an open wound. And yet, inside his house, the silence was so complete it felt like suffocation. Blankets still held Sophie's faint smell of lavender shampoo. Her tiny shoes sat by the couch, where she left them every afternoon after daycare. Eric picked one up, thumb tracing the fading cartoon character printed on the side, and the weight of memory nearly split him open. Narration deepened here, heavy with ache. This was a man unraveled, every breath a thread pulled loose. But loss alone did not explain why he filed suit so quickly. Grief and strategy often looked like twins in the distance. Up close, one carried love, the other survival. It was still unclear which one steered him. Maria Ellis, his attorney, visited that afternoon. She found Eric sitting on the floor, surrounded by Sophie's toys as though building a shrine without realizing it. The air smelled faintly of heat and stale coffee, and the blinds stayed shut though sunlight strained against them like an intruder. Description focused sharply. The living room felt thick with ghosts. Maria knelt beside him, voice low. "Eric, this case is only beginning. People think the lawsuit means you're hiding something." He didn't look up. "What else can they take from me?" She hesitated. "Everything, if you're not careful." Dialogue hit like slow lightning. Eric rubbed his face with both hands, palms shaking. "I'm not the villain they're painting on television." "No," Maria said, "but they will turn you into one if your story falls apart even for a second." The camera crews were back outside, waiting for movement, waiting for weakness. Their vans hummed like predators at rest. Eric finally met Maria's gaze, and for a heartbeat she saw something raw, fear braided with resolve, guilt indistinguishable from desperation. Later, when night fell thick and sleepless, Eric wandered into Sophie's bedroom. Narration carried emotion slow and relentless. He traced the outline of her pillow, then opened a drawer of crayon drawings, lopsided hearts, stick figure families where he always held her hand. Under them, a folded letter from the custody mediator reminded him that Sophie's mother, Lena, wanted majority custody. The words dug into him like hooks. Unstable home environment. Unpredictable behavior. Emotional volatility. He'd read the document 100 times, but grief made it sharper. It whispered questions he could not silence. If her mother had won custody, would Sophie still be alive? Had he filed the lawsuit for justice, or to prove he wasn't unfit? Strategy and love clashed with brutal force. The next day, Maria arranged media coaching, urging Eric to speak carefully, sparingly. But cameras caught him anyway, walking stiffly to his car, ignoring shouted questions. A journalist's voice cracked through the noise. "Eric, is the lawsuit about money or guilt?" He froze. Just long enough for every lens to capture doubt. Description tightened, sweat clung to his temples, jaw clenched like a man about to break. He said nothing, but silence sounded like strategy. Silence sounded suspicious. The footage aired everywhere by evening. While the city debated his restraint, detectives quietly reviewed case files. One noticed a discrepancy in the daycare timeline. Another flagged an odd gap in Eric's phone records. Nothing definitive, just enough to widen cracks. The lawsuit had opened doors Eric wasn't ready to walk through, and with each hour the line between grieving father and calculated actor blurred. And somewhere, in a newsroom lit with cold artificial light, a producer prepared Lena's scheduled interview. Ready to tear open the story from the other side, ready to bring forward the voice of a mother whose grief sounded nothing like strategy at all. Lena had been silent until now. Silent through headlines, silent through accusations, silent through the lawsuit that made Eric look like a man calculating his next move. But silence has a limit, and by the time the interview aired, America was ready to listen, not to strategy, not to speculation, but to a mother whose grief did not file paperwork. Her pain entered the story like fire. It burned away doubt, burned through sympathy, left only raw nerve and public fascination. The studio lighting washed her in pale gold, but nothing softened the tightness in her jaw. She looked smaller than she once had, thinner, as though every sleepless night carved away pieces of her. A framed photo of Sophie sat on the table beside her, bright with crayons and sunlight and memory. Narration gathered around the moment like slow thunder. This was the sound of heartbreak preparing to speak. The host leaned forward gently. "Lena, this is your first time addressing the public. Why now?" Lena's voice trembled, then steadied. "Because my daughter is gone," she said, "and the man who should be mourning with me is filing lawsuits instead." The world inhaled sharply. She went on, words measured like blades. "I'm not saying Eric wanted this. But I'm saying he knew his limits. He was overwhelmed. He was angry. And sometimes love is not enough to keep a child safe." Viewers watched, transfixed. Social media exploded. Hashtags bloomed like wildfire. In Eric's living room, the television glared back cold and merciless. The interview felt personal, as though the camera lens had become a weapon turned toward him. Description sharpened to cinematic detail, Lena's hands twisted in her lap like she was holding herself together. A tissue sat untouched on the table. Her voice quivered only when she said Sophie's name. Then the host asked what everyone waited for. "Do you believe Eric is responsible?" Lena inhaled slowly, eyes glossy. "I believe," she whispered, "that he should have protected her. And instead, he's protecting himself." It was not an accusation. It was devastation. And devastation carried further than anger ever could. But she wasn't finished. She reached into her purse, withdrew printed screenshots, hands trembling only slightly. "These are messages he sent me weeks before Sophie died," she said. "He told me he couldn't handle custody. That he was falling apart. That maybe she was better off with me." The host blinked. Cameras zoomed. The audience sensed the air shift. Dialogue cracked like glass. He said having her full-time was too much. That he needed space. He loved her, God, he loved her, but he was drowning. "Are you saying this was intentional?" "No," Lena replied, voice breaking into confession. "I'm saying he was breaking. And nobody listened." Back at Eric's house, he stared at the television as though watching his soul dissected in public. The phone buzzed non-stop, reporters, neighbors, strangers. He didn't answer. His pulse pounded louder than the commentary. Guilt crawled beneath his skin. Grief twisted like a hook. But strategy demanded silence. Outside, the sun fell and street lamps flickered awake. Protesters gathered again, angrier now, louder, believing Lena's voice over Eric's absence. The lawsuit no longer looked like courage. It looked like a shield. And while Eric stood motionless in the dark, detectives replayed the interview in their precinct, noting every word. Their focus sharpened. Their questions deepened. Something about Lena's tone hinted there was more fear, more truth, more fracture beneath the surface. Tomorrow, they would knock on doors. Tomorrow, They would test timelines. Tomorrow, even the autopsy wouldn't be safe from re-examination, and that would pull the story into Chapter 5 like a storm no one could stop. The interview detonated through Phoenix like a second sun, everywhere, blinding, inescapable. By the next morning, detectives who once thought the case was closed found themselves reopening files, replaying surveillance footage, refiling evidence that still smelled faintly of sidewalk heat and spilled applesauce. Lena's words had shifted everything. Not proof, not accusation, just weight. Enough weight that truth, once settled like dust, rose again into the air. Detective Hawthorne sat beneath fluorescent lights, reviewing the autopsy a third time. Sophie's recorded internal temperature scratched at his thoughts. It was high, too high, even for the searing day she died. The report suggested she had been in the car longer than Eric originally explained. Minutes mattered. Hours mattered more. Narration moved slow and methodical, mirroring his certainty hardening like desert clay. Something in the timeline no longer aligned. Across the city, Detective Ruiz made calls. A neighbor reported hearing raised voices that morning, the muffled sound of an argument through thin walls. She had thought nothing of it then. Now, under the glare of public scrutiny, memory sharpened like a knife. Meanwhile, Eric watched the news replay Lena's interview in looping misery. Each rotation stripped away more of his defenses. He paced between kitchen and living room, gripping a mug he never drank from. The lawsuit that once felt like salvation now felt like evidence against him. His silence, strategic yesterday, looked like guilt today. Maria Ellis arrived unannounced, stepping through the door with a face carved from urgency. Description tightened around the scene. She looked tired, hair pulled into a knot that had begun to unravel, eyes sharp but heavy with something close to pity. "We need to talk," she said. Eric set the mug down, slow, careful, as though the wrong movement might shatter more than porcelain. "What did they find?" he asked, though he wasn't sure if he meant the detectives or the public. Maria sat across from him at the kitchen table, paper folders stacked like court-bound artillery. Dialogue cut clean and precise. "The autopsy temperature suggests she was in the car longer than you stated." Eric's pulse stumbled. "I told them everything I remember." "Remembering isn't the same as truth," Maria replied gently, though the words landed like blows. "They're questioning if you were distracted. If you left her there without realizing. Or if there was more." Eric's throat constricted. "I would never." "I know," she whispered. "But knowledge doesn't matter when doubt is louder." Outside, cicadas wailed in the late afternoon scorch, a sound like static and sorrow. The house felt smaller, the walls inching inward with every breath. Grief swelled, threatening to spill over, but how could he cry when tears now looked like tactics? He stood, walked to the window, stared at the driveway where sunlight shimmered like memory. He could almost hear Sophie laugh from the back seat, could almost feel her sticky fingers on his cheek. Narration deepened into psychological fracture. Eric wondered if time itself had betrayed him, if exhaustion had carved holes into his memory so wide he'd fallen straight through. He hated the question rising in his mind, poisonous and impossible to escape. Did I forget her? Detectives weren't asking that publicly, not yet, but the implication clung to the air like humidity before a monsoon. Media anchors debated negligence versus intent. Protesters demanded charges. The daycare issued a shaky statement expressing sorrow but no responsibility. Heat radiated through every news cycle, blistering, relentless. As twilight bled across Phoenix, squad cars rolled down Eric Street. Not with sirens, not with urgency, just presence. A warning. A promise. The investigation was no longer passive. Tomorrow, Law and Crime would air a new analysis featuring Dwayne Cates. Tomorrow, the world would hear a legal mind unravel each thread of narrative, grain by grain, breath by breath. And tomorrow, guilt, innocence, and motive would collide beneath studio lights, pulling the story directly into its most public reckoning yet. The studio lights were cold, bright, nothing like the sun that had taken everything from them. Cameras blinked like watchful eyes, microphones hovered close enough to catch a whisper, and the world waited for a narrative it could devour. The host smiled, polished and neutral, yet rooted in the drama that fed the network like oxygen. Across from her, the mother sat in a black dress that looked too heavy for her thin body, hands clenched together as if to hold herself from breaking. She was no longer just a grieving parent, she was the center of the storm. She began softly. The room leaned in. Her voice trembled only once when she said his name, then steadied as though speaking of him out loud kept him alive for one more minute. She described laughter, a missing tooth, dreams of becoming an astronaut. The tragedy was not numbers or headlines, it was a little boy who wanted the moon. But grief turned into something sharper. She spoke of negligence, unanswered calls, a system that moved like molasses when minutes meant mortality. The host pressed gently, then harder. Viewers could feel the pivot, the tension beneath compassion. Was she here seeking justice, or building a case? Officials watching from home paled under her words, lawyers paused mid-page, and social media detonated with sympathy and suspicion. Her story was no longer contained to city borders, it belonged to the nation now. The interview was a match head, brief, bright, irreversible. When the cameras finally cut, she exhaled like someone stepping out of fire, unsure whether she'd escaped or fed it. Outside, reporters swarmed like heat-drunk bees. Something had shifted, something vast and unstoppable. Tomorrow, the father would speak. And his version was nothing like hers. The mother's interview had cracked the nation open, but it didn't break in just one direction. While sympathy poured like rain onto her doorstep, another current began to move beneath it, slow, cold, deliberate. Investigators replayed the broadcast frame by frame, analysts dissected her pauses and inflections, and somewhere in the swirl of public heartbreak a single question took shape more clearly than grief allowed. What if the story wasn't whole? The first hint surfaced quietly. A leaked document, then a text screenshot, then another interview, this time not with a grieving mother under studio lights, but with someone who once called her friend. Words like performance and pressure crept into headlines. At first, people resisted. They didn't want villains where they had built altars. But rumors are embers, fed just enough oxygen, they turn into wildfire. Within days, timelines divided, commentary sharpened, and the tragedy was no longer just tragedy, it became narrative warfare. Clips from the original interview were spliced into montages accusing her of exaggeration. Others defended her as a mother cornered by loss. Both sides believed they saw the truth. Both were convinced the other was blind. And then the father appeared. His interview didn't mirror hers, it cut across it like a blade. Calm where she trembled, factual where she pleaded, he provided dates, messages, inconsistencies. He never accused her directly, but the implication glowed like a branding iron. The nation leaned closer, breath held, waiting for the fracture to widen. It did. One outlet published a timeline that contradicted her emotional retelling. Another confirmed a detail she omitted. Suddenly the heat wave wasn't the only thing suffocating the city, the truth was burning too, and everyone could feel the scorch. By the time morning arrived, the world was no longer certain who deserved pity. Or who deserved blame. By the time the night settled over Phoenix, Eric Maddox had become something else entirely. A man unmoored, untethered from the world he once knew. The media had dissected him, the public had judged him, and even his lawyer's calm analysis could not pierce the fog pressing in around him. The interview, the leaks, the scrutiny, they had all stacked like stones on his chest. Breathing felt heavy, each inhale a reminder that nothing would ever be ordinary again. The house, once a sanctuary filled with Sophie's laughter and small belongings, had grown claustrophobic. The toys, the drawings, the scent of her shampoo, everything mocked him. Every object became a question. Did I fail her? Did I push too hard? Was the lawsuit a betrayal in itself? Narration carried the weight of his psychological unraveling, dark and relentless. He walked past the kitchen table, past the papers he could no longer read without seeing Sophie's absence, and out the back door into the night. The city lay in a blanket of warm air, the asphalt shimmering under streetlights. Description sharpened, the hum of cicadas, the distant wail of a siren, the smell of hot concrete lingering like memory. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he had to move. Maria's words echoed in his head, a faint warning that now felt too late. They will turn you into a villain if your story falls apart. Eric drove without destination, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly that knuckles whitened. Red lights blurred past, green lights mocked him, and every turn of the car wheels carried the weight of unspoken guilt. His phone buzzed endlessly in the cup holder, journalists, neighbors, notifications, but he ignored it. No one could reach him. Not the law, not the media, not even the mother of his child. He felt untouchable and utterly fragile at once. Hours passed, the city thinning behind him, until he arrived at the overlook above the canyon, headlights slicing through darkness. He parked, stepped out, and the cool wind did little to quell the heat still burning in his chest. The abyss below reflected the emptiness he felt inside. Narration deepened, describing his isolation, his breakdown, his fragile grip on reason. He knew the cameras, the detectives, the analysts would dissect his next move, But right now, nothing mattered except the silence, the distance, the finality. He left behind a letter, unsigned, simple, "You win." The car doors closed, the engine cut. Outside, the night waited, patient, unyielding, watching. By morning, the city would find him. Detectives would arrive. Media crews would swarm. And the story, already public, would shift again. This time, not about Sophie, not about blame, but about Eric himself, his choices, and the point at which grief became something else entirely. Tomorrow, the toll of truth would demand its reckoning, and there would be no turning back. The dawn arrived pale, fragile, and unforgiving. News crews lined the overlook above the canyon, their cameras trained on the scene where Eric Maddox had disappeared into the night. Yellow tape fluttered in the early breeze, its movement whispering warnings that no one could quite ignore. Detectives moved like shadows along the edge, notebooks in hand, radio crackling with fragments of information. Narration carried the weight of inevitability. A man crushed by scrutiny, grief, and his own decisions had become the centerpiece of tragedy. Inside the Maddox home, Maria Ellis stood motionless, phone in hand, digesting the confirmation. Her voice caught only once, sharp and brittle. "He's gone." She did not cry. There was no time, no place, and perhaps no strength left for tears. The lawsuit, the interviews, the arguments with Lena, all of it collapsed into one unbearable fact. Eric would not face justice, or exoneration, or closure. He would not face anything at all. Outside, reporters spoke in hushed, urgent tones. Pedestrians slowed, peering from streets and sidewalks, whispers riding on the wind. Did he mean to? Did he regret it? Did anyone understand what drove him here? Description tightened. The canyon below stretched infinite and dark, a reflection of the emptiness now in Eric's absence, a mirror to the questions everyone carried but could not answer. Detectives combed through evidence one last time. Some reports confirmed inconsistencies, others only highlighted the fragility of human memory. The autopsy was complete, the lawsuit remained filed but unresolved. No verdict would be read. No apology would satisfy. Only the shadow of what happened stretched over Phoenix like heat that never dissipated. Meanwhile, Lena walked past reporters, clutching a small photo of Sophie to her chest. Her expression was unreadable, grief, anger, and relief tangled together. Dialogue surfaced briefly, a fragment captured by a microphone. "She's gone," she whispered. "But he's gone too. And still, nothing feels complete." Dwayne Cates appeared live on Law and Crime that afternoon, studio lights casting calm against the storm of public opinion. He spoke carefully, analytically, dissecting events with precision, but even he could not soften the edges of what had unfolded. "Sometimes," he said, "the law can't answer everything. Sometimes, truth exacts its own toll, beyond courtroom doors, beyond media narratives." The city simmered, the media churned, and the human cost loomed large. News cycles cycled through speculation and reaction, but beneath it all was a simple, unyielding fact: tragedy leaves no neat ending. Grief persists, guilt persists, and questions linger longer than anyone expects. At nightfall, Maria closed the Maddox house, lights dimmed, evidence bags packed away. Outside, Phoenix remained indifferent to the human drama inside it, the desert air heavy and still. Tomorrow, attention would shift, stories would pivot, and yet Sophie's absence, and Eric's, would remain. The chapter ended not with resolution, but with reflection. The world had witnessed loss, and even as cameras and microphones moved on, the toll of truth had already carved itself deep into the lives of everyone left behind. The courthouse loomed empty the morning after Eric Maddox was found. Its walls were silent, the steps untrampled, and the doors closed to a trial that would never happen. The lawsuit remained filed, unresolved, a ghost of intent more than action. Narration carried the emptiness like a pulse, every public argument, every analysis, every accusation dissolved into quiet absence. No verdict would be delivered. No judgment passed. Only echoes remained, bouncing through corridors of memory and media alike. News anchors replayed footage of Eric's last drive, Lena's interviews, and snippets from Dwayne Cates' analysis. Each clip reminded the audience that certainty had fled the city. People debated endlessly. Was Eric negligent? Was he innocent? Was Lena too harsh, or simply truthful? Their voices rose, collided, and fractured further, but the answers were elusive. The public had consumed the narrative, yet the story itself remained unfinished, suspended like heat in the desert air. Maria Ellis sat in her office, empty coffee cup at her side, papers untouched. The silence pressed in heavier than any courtroom debate could have. Dialogue emerged only once, strained, brittle. "He's gone." There's nothing more we can do. Yes, Maria whispered to herself. Except carry what's left. Across town, Lena walked along a quiet street, holding a faded photograph of Sophie. She paused at the park where the little girl once ran, laughing, unaware of the world's cruelty. She traced the lines of Sophie's smile with a trembling finger, words unspoken pressing against her chest. Nothing fixes this. Nothing balances it. The detectives closed their files for the last time. The gaps in timelines, the inconsistencies, the subtle questions of negligence, all of it was catalogued, noted, and left unresolved. For the law, there was nothing more to pursue. For the public, there was endless discussion. For the families involved, there was only the absence that no statute or analysis could ever fill. Even Dwayne Cates reflected on the case with unusual gravity during his final broadcast segment. He dissected timelines, motives, and inconsistencies with precision, yet admitted aloud that some truths do not lend themselves to courtroom clarity. Description heightened, studio lights cast long shadows across his face, emphasizing that some human stories resist neat conclusions. And the city itself moved forward, oblivious yet scarred. Streetlights flickered on, the desert sun dipped, and Phoenix exhaled a quiet, indifferent sigh. People returned to routine, but beneath the surface, questions, grief, and doubt remained in restless, simmering motion. As night fell, the courthouse stood like a monument to unfinished business, silent except for the echoes of arguments, interviews, and lost voices that would never resolve. Each echo carried fragments of grief, suspicion, and human frailty, and together they lingered, insistent and unyielding, refusing closure. Tomorrow would come, but the questions would persist. The past could not be rewritten. The future remained uncertain. And the echoes, unrelenting, continued to remind everyone that some stories do not end, they simply resonate. 1 year later, Phoenix simmered under a sun that felt no different than the day Sophie Maddox died. Streets stretched dry and shimmering, the desert heat pressing against every corner of the city. And yet, beneath the sun-baked asphalt, something colder persisted, memory, unrelenting, refusing reprieve. Narration carried the weight of reflection, of a tragedy both intimate and public, a story whose ripples would never fully settle. Dwayne Cates sat in a dimly lit studio, the hum of equipment around him a quiet backdrop to the story he was about to revisit. Cameras clicked into place. Microphones hovered. And though he had analyzed the case a year ago with cold precision, this time there was reflection, a subtle tremor in his voice he rarely allowed to surface. This story, he began, is not about verdicts, lawsuits, or media cycles. It is about human fragility. About the consequences of grief, guilt, and choices made under unbearable pressure. Some of those choices we can understand. Some we cannot. And some are left for the echoes to carry, long after public attention has moved on. Description framed the studio. Warm shadows stretched across walls lined with monitors showing snippets from past interviews, courtroom footage, and photographs of Sophie, sunlit, smiling, forever 3 years old. Dwayne paused, gazing at the images as if acknowledging the cost of dissecting tragedy for an audience. Meanwhile, Lena placed a small memorial in the park where Sophie used to play. A single photograph, slightly faded from sun and rain, leaned against a tree stump, surrounded by tiny flowers and hand-drawn hearts. She whispered Sophie's name into the desert wind, voice carrying both love and accusation. Dialogue arrived only here. I hope you know we never forgot you, baby girl. Maria Ellis, too, felt the weight of absence. She walked through her office, papers neatly filed, yet every document reminded her of Eric, the father whose fate had been determined not by courtroom verdicts, but by pressure, isolation, and personal collapse. Her hands lingered over one legal folder, unopened for months. The city pulsed outside with indifferent motion. Phoenix moved on, yet the people involved could not. Their memories, their grief, and their unanswered questions simmered beneath the surface like residual heat, relentless and unyielding. Dwayne concluded the special, reflecting aloud on the human cost of scrutiny, media, and law. We study these cases to understand what went wrong, to see patterns, to prevent them. But sometimes understanding is only partial. Sometimes the heat lingers, and it never truly cools. The camera zoomed slowly on Sophie's photograph, the sunlight catching her small smile. Shadows stretched long across the park. The air seemed still, yet every element, the wind, the pavement, the empty streets, carried the invisible weight of grief, of lives irrevocably changed. And so, the story ended without closure, without full resolution, without justice in the traditional sense. It ended with reflection, memory, and a persistent warmth that no amount of time could extinguish. The heat never cooled, and it would not be forgotten.